Week 16, Overview, Unconditional Surrender. This week, we finally reached the end of World War II, but it was a costly victory. So many people, men, women, and children, lost their lives as the Axis powers hung on despite clear indicators that they were doomed to lose the conflict. The Axis had nothing to gain by negotiating, for the Allies demanded unconditional surrender. There were moments when the Allies realized why they were there, like when they liberated the few remaining survivors from Hitler's horrible death camps. It was hard to understand the magnitude of the evil that had been done there. Though their eyes beheld the evidence, Allied troops still had trouble comprehending warehouses full of hair and clothing and shoes of little children. The Western Allies, chiefly Great Britain and America, teamed up with grim determination to utterly smash the Third Reich. In January 1943, President Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill in Casablanca, in North Africa. It was there that they announced a no-compromise, total surrender policy for Germany. Japan had no Holocaust as such, but the treachery of Pearl Harbor and atrocities like the Rape of Nanking and the Bataan Death March made a negotiated peace with Japan equally impossible. The only way to end this war was by crushing the enemy completely. Japan and Germany were totally committed, but Italy was not, and Italy was in trouble. The Allied victory at El Alamein in North Africa in 1942 pushed Axis forces back to Tunisia, just 100 miles across the Mediterranean from the Italian island of Sicily. When the Allies broke through the last defenses at Tunis in early 1943, 230,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. Allied troops invaded Sicily and prepared to cross over to the mainland. Hitler realized that he had made a mistake in picking Italy for an ally. That summer, at his orders, Mussolini was deposed and imprisoned. The Italians secretly negotiated for surrender with the Allies, but Hitler sent his commanders and soldiers to hold Italy against the Allied forces. After months of bitter fighting, Allied forces liberated Rome. If your family ever watches historical movies together, I can strongly recommend an old film called The Scarlet and the Black. Based on a true story, it stars Gregory Peck as a Catholic priest who smuggles prisoners of war in and out of the Vatican. Warning: if you love Christopher Plummer as the anti-Nazi Austrian patriot in The Sound of Music, it'll take some adjustment to see him as the Nazi ruler of Rome. But the film ends with a scene of reconciliation, for SS Colonel Herbert Kappler really did become a Catholic after his arrest and long imprisonment for war crimes. 1943 was hard on Hitler. As we learned last week, the German army had been defeated in Stalingrad in February of 1943. Later that year, they lost the greatest tank battle in history, the Battle of Kursk. The Soviets began a slow but relentless drive that pushed the Germans out of Russia. Meanwhile, bombs were falling on Berlin. Roosevelt noted, "Hitler has built a wall around Europe, only he forgot to put a roof over it." Raids on Hamburg and Dresden set so many houses on fire that it produced a lethal updraft of flame and oxygen called a firestorm. Between 300,000 and 600,000 German civilians were killed by Allied bombs before the war was over. But no amount of bombs could replace boots on the ground. The Allies knew they had to break through immense German fortifications along the Atlantic coast. On June 6, 1944, one day after the Allies liberated Rome, they launched the greatest operation of the war, D-Day. Allied leaders selected 5 points along the northern coast of France for British, American, and Canadian armies to land. The preparations for the landing were extraordinary. Many books have been written about all the special weapons, logistics, and maneuvers that made it possible. On the night before the invasion, paratroopers dropped behind the enemy lines to disrupt German communications. Meanwhile, the trip across the Channel commenced in the dark. 9,000 aircraft covered the fleet of 5,000 ships as they moved across the southern part of the Channel towards the Normandy coast. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the D-Day landing commenced. By evening, 150,000 Allied troops had successfully landed in Normandy and established beachheads. Once they took the beach, the Allies went for Paris. George S. Patton led the breakout from Normandy. It was quick. Allied troops swept through northern France and liberated Paris on August 25, 1944. It seemed like the German troops were melting away. Hitler ordered one last major offensive against the Allies. On December 16th, the Germans attacked the American forces stationed in the Ardennes forest of Luxembourg in southern Belgium. Hitler hit the weak American lines by surprise and created a massive bulge in those lines. But General Patton led a brilliant counterattack that drove the enemy back. That broke the back of Hitler's Western Front. The Soviets on the Eastern Front marched relentlessly towards Berlin. On June 22, 1944, 3 years to the day after the Germans had invaded Russia, the Soviets launched a huge assault against the German Army Group Center. The Germans were totally defeated. Throughout late 1944, the Soviets continued to advance. Although the Americans were close also, Eisenhower stopped his men at the Elbe River and allowed the Soviets to take Berlin. The Battle of Berlin between the Soviet and German armies began on April 16, 1945. By April 24th, the city was surrounded by the Soviet army. As the Soviets made their way through the city, they were merciless to the Germans, committing many crimes against the Germans who still remained in Berlin. As the Allies closed in, Hitler began to wonder whether the Germans were truly worthy of him. He came to believe that everyone around him had failed him. On April 29, 1945, Hitler married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. The next day, he and Eva committed suicide in a bunker beneath Berlin. Soviet troops were already in Berlin as he died. The Germans immediately offered to surrender. VE Day, Victory in Europe, was declared on May 8, 1945. Americans were filled with joy and sorrow. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had led them through the Great Depression and the world's greatest war, but he died 2 weeks before Hitler killed himself. Vice President Harry S. Truman, a plain-spoken Missouri man, became the president. It was Truman who saw Victory in Europe Day declared, Truman who made the fateful decisions that ended the war with Japan. Truman was briefed on a number of national security matters after he took office. On April 24th, 5 days before Hitler's death, Truman was stunned to find out that America had been working on a super bomb. The Manhattan Project was so top secret that the Vice President of the United States didn't even know about it, and now he had to decide whether to use it or not. We'll get to Truman's decision by the end of our overview, but we'll need to understand what was happening with Japan to appreciate why he made the choice that he did. The Allies were fighting the Japanese in a series of desperate battles across the Pacific. Japan controlled large islands like the Philippines and tiny atolls like Okinawa and Iwo Jima. They would not relinquish 1 inch of these islands without making the Allies pay dearly in blood. The Japanese cultural and military values compelled them never to surrender and to die fighting. And so they did, month after month, as the Allies liberated first one island and then another at the cost of so many lives and so much heartache. The Japanese proved themselves fierce warriors who chose death before dishonor. Kamikaze pilots steered their planes into American ships. Japanese soldiers blew themselves up if they could take out one more Allied soldier. The Allies assumed the Japanese would fight even harder for their home islands if they were invaded. Every prudent calculation said it would take at least 500,000 Allied casualties to conquer Japan. Most assumed 1 million. Truman decided that Japanese civilians, not American soldiers, must pay the price for the stand the Japanese military leaders chose to take. It took 2 atomic bombs. The Japanese officials simply couldn't believe what they heard after the first bomb fell on Hiroshima, so America dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, the only Christian city in Japan. More than 210,000 innocent Japanese civilians died in those 2 blasts. The Emperor of Japan announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, which became known as VJ Day, Victory over Japan. World War II was finally over. The biggest war in human history was over, a war where 1 million died in a single battle, where cities died with a single bomb, where more than 6 million people were killed just for being Jewish. The men and women who struggled through those times have been called the greatest generation, for good reason. May we learn from their example as we lead the next generation forward.